What happens when an 82-year-old man receives a mysterious letter on his birthday that changes everything? Tonight we'll discover how one grandfather's shocking decision to enter university at his age exposed family secrets, challenged everything his loved ones thought they knew about him, and proved that some dreams are worth waiting 8 decades to pursue. This isn't just about going back to school. It's about a man who refused to let age define his limits and the incredible journey that followed. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, I want to hear from you. Please comment below and let us know which city you're watching from right now. Are you joining us from New York, São Paulo, London, Tokyo? I love connecting with our global audience, so drop your city in the comments and let's see how far this story travels tonight. The morning of March 15th started like any other birthday for Harold Whitman. At 82, he had grown accustomed to quiet celebrations. A phone call from his daughter, Sarah in California, a visit from his son Michael, who lived across town, and perhaps a small cake from the local bakery. But this birthday would be different. This birthday would change the trajectory of his entire life. Harold sat in his favorite armchair, the same one where he'd read bedtime stories to his grandchildren years ago, now faded and worn like the man himself. His silver hair caught the morning light streaming through the kitchen window of his modest home in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The house felt too big since Martha had passed 3 years ago, too quiet, too full of memories. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:47 a.m. Mr. Whitman? The postal worker held an official-looking envelope, the kind that usually meant bad news or taxes. This requires your signature. Harold's weathered hands trembled slightly as he signed for the package. The return address made his heart skip. University of Iowa. Office of Admissions. He hadn't seen those words in over 60 years. Inside his kitchen, surrounded by birthday cards from well-meaning neighbors and a grocery list, Martha had written that he couldn't bring himself to throw away. Harold opened the envelope with the careful precision of a man who had learned that life could change in an instant. Dear Mr. Whitman, the letter began, we are pleased to inform you that after careful review of your application and supporting materials, you have been accepted into the University of Iowa's English Literature program, beginning fall semester 2024. Harold read the letter 3 times, each reading making the words more real, more impossible, more terrifying. His hands shook not from age, but from the magnitude of what he was holding. 62 years ago, Harold Whitman had been accepted to this same university. 62 years ago, he had torn up his acceptance letter and thrown it in the trash can behind Morrison's General Store, where he worked to support his widowed mother and 3 younger siblings. The Korean War was raging, money was scarce, and dreams were luxuries the Whitman family couldn't afford. He had never told anyone about that first acceptance letter. Not Martha, not his children, not even himself on most days. Chapter 2. The Weight of Unfulfilled Dreams. Harold moved to his study, a small room lined with books he had collected over the decades. Martha used to tease him about his library, but she never understood that each book represented a piece of the education he never received, the conversations he never had, the person he never became. On his desk sat a framed photograph of his family, Sarah, Michael, and their children, all smiling at last Christmas. They were proud of him, he knew. Proud of the successful hardware store he had built from nothing. Proud of the pillar of the community he had become. Proud of the devoted husband and father he had been. But they had no idea about the secret that had eaten at him for over 6 decades. The phone rang, startling him from his reverie. Happy birthday, Dad. Sarah's voice bubbled through the receiver. Are you having a good day? Michael said he's coming over around 2 with the kids. Sarah, Harold said, his voice carrying a weight she had never heard before. I need to tell you something. There was a pause. Sarah lived 2,000 miles away, but she could sense when something was different about her father. What is it, Dad? Are you okay? Harold looked at the acceptance letter in his other hand. I've been accepted to university. Silence. Dad, I think I misheard you. Did you say University of Iowa, English Literature? I start in September. The silence stretched longer this time. Harold could picture his daughter in her San Francisco apartment, trying to process what she had just heard. Dad, You applied to college. I reapplied, yes. But why? I mean, Dad, you're 82 years old. Harold closed his eyes. Because, sweetheart, I was accepted once before. In 1962, and I never went. Over the next hour, Harold told Sarah the story he had never shared with anyone. How he had been valedictorian of Cedar Falls High School. How his English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had encouraged him to apply to university, even helped him with the application. How he had dreamed of studying literature, of perhaps becoming a teacher or a writer, and how on the day his acceptance letter arrived, his mother had been diagnosed with tuberculosis. I had to choose, Harold explained, his voice barely above a whisper. The family needed me to work full-time. Your grandmother needed medicine. Your uncles were just kids. Sarah was crying now, 2,000 miles away. Dad, why didn't you ever tell us? What was the point? I made my choice. I built a life. I married your mother, raised you and Michael. I was happy. Were you, though, really? Harold looked around his study at all those books, at all those years of wondering what if. I convinced myself I was. But, Sarah, when your mother died, something changed. I realized I've been carrying this regret for 60 years. And last month, when I was cleaning out the attic, I found my old high school transcripts. On impulse, I applied again, and they accepted you. They accepted me. By the time Michael arrived that afternoon with his wife, Jennifer and their teenage twins, Jessica and Ryan, the news had spread through the family like wildfire. Harold could see the mixture of concern and bewilderment on their faces as they gathered in his living room. Michael, a practical man who had inherited his father's business sense, but not his hidden dreams, was the first to speak. Dad, I have to ask, is this about Mom? Because if you're feeling lonely, there are other ways to meet people. Senior centers, community groups. This isn't about loneliness, Michael. Then what? Dad, you're talking about student loans, dormitories, professors who are younger than your grandchildren. Have you really thought this through? Harold stood up, moving to the window that overlooked Martha's garden. She had planted roses there 40 years ago, and somehow, despite his neglect, they still bloomed every spring. I've thought about nothing else for 60 years. Jennifer, who had always been the peacemaker in the family, tried to bridge the growing tension. Harold, we're not saying it's impossible. We're just concerned about the practical aspects. The physical demands, the technology, the social environment. I can handle walking to class, Jennifer. I may be old, but I'm not decrepit. Jessica, 16 and currently struggling with her own college applications, looked up from her phone. Grandpa, that's actually kind of awesome. But where would you live? In the dorms with 18-year-olds? Harold smiled for the first time that day. I haven't figured out all the details yet, Jessica. I just got the letter this morning. Wait. Ryan, Jessica's twin, suddenly looked interested. Grandpa, are you really going to be a college freshman at 82? I suppose I am. The room fell quiet as everyone processed this reality. Sarah's voice crackled through the speakerphone from California. Dad, what does this mean for the store? For your life here? Michael shifted uncomfortably. They all knew the hardware store was struggling to compete with the big box retailers. Harold had been talking about retirement for years, but they also knew the store was more than a business to him. It was his identity, his contribution to the community, his legacy. I'll figure it out, Harold said simply. Dad? Michael's voice carried a frustration born of love and fear. You can't just uproot your entire life at 82 because of some midlife crisis that's happening 60 years too late. Harold turned from the window, and for a moment, his family saw something in his eyes they had never seen before, a fire that had been banked but never extinguished. Michael, I spent 60 years building the life I thought I was supposed to have. I was a good husband, a good father, a good businessman, but I never got to find out who I might have been. Your mother knew this about me, even if we never talked about it directly. On her deathbed, do you know what she said to me? Nobody answered. She said, Harold, promise me you won't spend the rest of your life wondering what if. I made her a promise, Michael, and I intend to keep it. Over the next 3 months, Harold Whitman began the most unlikely chapter of his life. He sold the hardware store to a regional chain, though he negotiated to stay on as a part-time consultant. He enrolled in a computer literacy course at the community college, struggling with concepts that his great-grandchildren took for granted. The hardest part wasn't learning to use email or understanding online course registration. The hardest part was believing he deserved this second chance. "You sure about this, Harold?" asked Bill Morrison, his oldest friend and the son of the man who had owned the general store where Harold once worked. They were having coffee at Marge's Diner, the same booth where they had sat every Tuesday morning for 23 years. "I'm sure, Bill. But college at our age? Hell, I can barely remember where I put my reading glasses half the time." Harold smiled. "That's why I'm studying literature, not engineering. If I forget a plot point, I can just reread the chapter." Bill laughed, but Harold could see the concern in his friend's eyes. "What if you can't keep up? What if the other students? I don't know, what if they treat you like some kind of curiosity?" Harold had wondered the same thing. "Then I'll learn something about human nature along with Shakespeare." The conversation that haunted him most, though, was the one with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, his academic advisor at the university. She was younger than his daughter, brilliant, and trying very hard to be supportive, while clearly wondering if she was about to witness an academic disaster. "Mr. Whitman, I have to ask, what are your goals here? Are you looking for personal enrichment, or do you intend to complete a full degree?" "I want to graduate, Dr. Chen. I want to walk across that stage and get my diploma. That's a 4-year commitment. You understand that? I'm 82, not senile. If I'm lucky enough to live to 86, I'd like to be 86 with a college degree." Dr. Chen had smiled at that, the first genuine smile of their meeting. "Fair enough. Let's talk about your course load." September 3rd, 2024. Harold Whitman stood outside Phillips Hall, home to the University of Iowa's English department, clutching a new backpack that Jessica had insisted he needed. Students flowed around him like water around a stone, 18-year-olds with their entire lives ahead of them, completely unaware that they were sharing the sidewalk with someone who had waited 60 years for this moment. His first class was Introduction to Literary Analysis, with Professor Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s who specialized in contemporary American fiction. Harold took a seat in the back corner, hoping to observe before he had to participate. "Good morning, everyone. Welcome to English 101. Before we dive into our first text, I'd like everyone to introduce themselves, name, hometown, and one book that changed your life." Harold's stomach clenched. He had prepared for academic challenges, but not for the social vulnerability of being the obvious outsider. One by one, students introduced themselves. Jennifer from Des Moines, who loved The Fault in Our Stars. Marcus from Chicago, whose life was changed by Invisible Man. Sarah from Portland, not his daughter, who credited The Handmaid's Tale with opening her eyes to feminism. Then it was Harold's turn. "I'm Harold Whitman from Cedar Falls, and the book that changed my life was To Kill a Mockingbird, to which I read when it first came out in 1960. The room went quiet. Professor Santos looked at him with new interest. "Mr. Whitman, when you say when it first came out..." "I was 18. Same age as most of you. I bought it at Morrison's General Store for $3.95, which was a lot of money in those days." A student named Alex raised his hand. "Wait, you're saying you were alive when Harper Lee published that book?" "I was alive, Alex. I was your age, working in my first job, and that book made me realize that literature wasn't just entertainment. It was a way to understand the world, to develop empathy, to question the status quo." Professor Santos leaned forward. "Mr. Whitman, if you don't mind me asking, what brings you here now?" Harold looked around the room at these young faces, these students who had no idea what it meant to defer a dream for 60 years. "I'm here because I finally figured out that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." The first month was brutal, not because of the academic work. Harold discovered that a lifetime of reading had prepared him well for literary analysis. The challenge was everything else. Technology was his nemesis. While his classmates effortlessly submitted assignments through the online portal, Harold spent hours figuring out how to convert his typed papers to PDF files. Group projects meant coordinating via text messages and shared Google documents. concepts that made his head spin. Grandpa Harold, that's what Jessica had taken to calling him since he started college. She was visiting for the weekend, ostensibly to see her parents, but really to check on her grandfather's progress. Let me show you how to use the discussion forum. They sat together at Harold's kitchen table, Jessica's laptop between them. She walked him through posting responses to the weekly discussion questions, showing him how to reply to other students' posts and cite his sources properly. "The kids in your class, are they nice to you?" Jessica asked with the directness that only 16-year-olds could manage. Harold considered the question. "They're curious. Some are helpful, like a young man named David who always saves me a seat. Others seem to see me as some kind of novelty. And a few, I think, wonder if I'm taking a spot that should go to someone younger. That's stupid. You earned your spot just like everyone else." "Did I, though? Sometimes I wonder if the admissions committee accepted me as some kind of publicity stunt. Look at us, we're so inclusive we admit octogenarians." Jessica looked at her grandfather with surprising seriousness. "Grandpa, have you seen your grades?" Harold had been afraid to check his first test results, but when he finally logged into the student portal, he discovered something that shocked him. He was earning A's, not the generous A's given to elderly students out of pity, but legitimate, rigorous A's that reflected deep understanding and thoughtful analysis. "I think I might actually be good at this," he admitted to Jessica. "Of course you are. You've been preparing for this class for 60 years. The turning point came in October. During a discussion of Toni Morrison's Beloved, Professor Santos had assigned the class to analyze the role of memory in the novel, and most students were struggling with the complex narrative structure and heavy themes." Harold raised his hand, something he had started doing more frequently as his confidence grew. "Yes, Mr. Whitman, I've been thinking about Setha's relationship with memory, and I think Morrison is doing something revolutionary here. She's not just writing about the trauma of slavery. She's writing about how trauma lives in the body, how it passes from generation to generation." The room was unusually quiet. Harold continued. "When I was a young man, we didn't talk about trauma the way we do now. Men who came back from the war, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, they were expected to just move on, to bury their experiences and get back to normal life. But Morrison is showing us that memory doesn't work that way. It lives in our bodies, in our families, in our communities." Professor Santos nodded slowly. "That's a sophisticated reading. Mr. Whitman, can you elaborate on how Morrison uses the supernatural elements to explore this theme?" "The Ghost of Beloved isn't just a literary device," Harold said, surprised by his own confidence. "She's the embodiment of everything that can't be forgotten, shouldn't be forgotten. She's the past demanding recognition, demanding that we confront what we'd rather leave buried." After class, David, the student who had been saving Harold's seats, approached him. "Mr. Whitman, that was incredible. I never thought about the book that way." "You're very kind, David." "No, seriously. You bring this perspective that none of us have. You've lived through history that we've only read about. When you talk about how veterans were treated, or what it was like in the 1960s, it makes the literature come alive." That evening, Harold called Sarah in California. "I think I'm actually contributing something," he told her. "I'm not just some old man playing student. I'm bringing my life experience into dialogue with these texts in ways that help everyone understand them better." "Dad, that's wonderful. How are you feeling physically? Are you keeping up with the workload?" "I'm tired," Harold admitted. "More tired than I've been in years. But it's a good tired. It's the tiredness that comes from using your mind in ways you forgot were possible." By midterm, Harold Whitman had become something of a campus celebrity, not because of his age, but because of his insights. His professors had begun calling on him regularly, and students had started seeking him out during office hours, not for help with coursework, but for perspective on life. "Mr. Whitman," asked Emma, a sophomore in his American literature class, "how do you not get overwhelmed by how much you don't know? I mean, I'm 20, and I already feel like I'm behind, like I'll never read everything I want to read." They were sitting in the student union, an unlikely pair, the 82-year-old freshman and the 20-year-old sophomore, sharing coffee and conversation. Emma, I spent 60 years thinking I had missed my chance to learn. Every book I read, every conversation about ideas I wanted to have, felt like a reminder of opportunities lost. But here's what I've discovered. Knowledge isn't a race. Understanding doesn't have an expiration date. But don't you feel pressure? Like you're running out of time? Harold smiled. I'm 82 years old. Of course I'm running out of time. But that doesn't make learning less valuable. It makes it more precious. Every book I read now, every discussion I have, every paper I write is a gift I gave myself by refusing to accept that it was too late. Word of Harold's unique perspective began to spread beyond the English department. Professor James Wright from the History department invited him to guest lecture in his course on 20th Century America. Mr. Whitman lived through many of the events we study. Professor Wright told his students he can provide first-hand perspective on the social changes of the 1960s, the economic shifts of the 1970s and 80s, the cultural evolution we've discussed in abstract terms. Standing in front of a lecture hall filled with students, Harold felt a terror he hadn't experienced since his first day of class. But as he began to speak about coming of age during the civil rights movement, about watching the first moon landing, about the day President Kennedy was shot, he realized he wasn't just sharing memories, he was connecting the past to the present in ways that textbooks couldn't. History isn't just facts and dates, he told the students. It's the lived experience of ordinary people making extraordinary choices. When I decided not to go to college in 1962, I thought I was just solving a family financial crisis. I had no idea I was participating in a larger story about class, opportunity, and social mobility in America. But success in the classroom came with personal costs Harold hadn't anticipated. The intensive study schedule, the emotional demands of engaging with challenging literature, the social energy required to navigate campus life. It all took a toll. In November, Harold fainted during Professor Santos's class. One moment he was discussing the symbolism in Flannery, O'Connor's "A Good Man is Hard to Find." The next he was on the floor with concerned faces hovering over him. Just tired, he insisted to the paramedics. But they insisted on taking him to the hospital for evaluation. Michael was furious when he arrived at the emergency room. "Dad, this is exactly what we were worried about. You're pushing yourself too hard." "Michael, I'm fine. My blood pressure was a little low. I hadn't eaten lunch." "You're 82 years old and you're trying to keep up with teenagers." "This is insane." Harold looked at his son, successful, practical, loving, and completely unable to understand what this opportunity meant to him. "Michael, if I die tomorrow, I want to die as a student. I want to die learning, growing, becoming. I spent 60 years being safe, being practical, being responsible. These might be my last good years, and I refuse to spend them just waiting to die." The doctor, a woman about Sarah's age, entered with test results. "Mr. Whitman, you're dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise healthy. However, I have to ask, are you taking on too much? College is demanding even for traditional students." "Doctor, what would you say if I told you I was finally doing what I was meant to do?" She studied his chart, then looked at him with new interest. "I'd say that meaningful work is medicine, but even medicine can be toxic in the wrong doses." They compromised. Harold would reduce his course load from 4 classes to 3, ensure he ate regular meals, and check in with his doctor monthly. He would also accept help with technology and transportation from his fellow students. The experience brought an unexpected benefit. It cemented his relationships with his classmates. When he returned to class the following week, he found his seat decorated with Get Well, cards, and a thermos of soup from David's girlfriend. "We were worried about you, Mr. Whitman," said Alex, the student who had been skeptical of him on the first day. "You're kind of the best part of this class." "Yeah," added Emma. "You make us think about things differently. Like you've actually lived through the stuff we're reading about. It makes it real." Professor Santos assigned the most challenging project of the semester in December. A 20-page research paper connecting a work of literature to personal experience. Students groaned, but Harold felt a flutter of excitement. "Choose a text that resonates with your own life story," Professor Santos explained. "Analyze how the literary work illuminates something about your personal experience and how your experience brings new understanding to the text. Harold knew immediately what he would write about: Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman and the Dreams We Abandon. For 3 weeks he worked on the paper with an intensity that worried his family. He would wake at 4 a.m. to write, driven by the need to articulate something he had never put into words before. The paper became a meditation on deferred dreams, on the price of practical choices, on the ways society defines success and failure. He wrote about Willy Loman's desperate pursuit of the American dream and connected it to his own story of sacrifice and regret. He analyzed the play's treatment of aging and obsolescence, drawing parallels to his own fear of becoming irrelevant. Most powerfully, he examined the character of Biff, Willy's son, who struggles to understand his father's choices, and connected it to his relationship with Michael. Miller shows us that the tragedy isn't in failing to achieve our dreams. Harold wrote in his conclusion, "The tragedy is in accepting that we don't deserve them." Willy Loman dies believing he is worthless because his dreams were never realized. But at 82, I've learned that dreams don't expire. They wait, they evolve. They find new forms and new possibilities if we have the courage to resurrect them. When Professor Santos returned the papers, Harold's had a grade he hadn't seen since high school, A+. But more than the grade, it was her written comment that moved him. "Mr. Whitman, this is one of the most insightful pieces of literary criticism I've ever read. You've shown how literature and life illuminate each other in ways that transform both the reader and the text. Thank you for sharing your story with such honesty and analytical rigor." Christmas 2024 was different. For the first time in years, Sarah flew home from California, and the whole family gathered in Harold's house. But the dynamic had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Jessica peppered her grandfather with questions about his classes, his professors, his plans for next semester. Ryan, initially skeptical, had become Harold's biggest champion, bragging to his friends that his grandfather was basically the coolest college student ever. Michael and Jennifer were more cautious, still worried about Harold's health and the practical implications of his choices. But even Michael had to admit that his father seemed more alive, more engaged, more himself than he had been since Martha's death. "Dad," Michael said on Christmas morning, as they sat together drinking coffee and watching the grandchildren open presents, "I owe you an apology." "What for?" "For not understanding. For trying to talk you out of this. I was scared and I let my fear make me selfish." Harold studied his son's face. "You weren't selfish, Michael. You were being protective. There's a difference. But I didn't trust you to know what was best for your own life. To be fair, I wasn't entirely sure myself." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Jessica show Ryan some feature on her new laptop. "How do you do it, Dad? How do you sit in classes with kids who are younger than your grandchildren and not feel, I don't know, ridiculous?" Harold considered the question. "At first I did feel ridiculous, but then I realized something. They don't see me as an old man trying to be young. They see me as someone who has something to offer. My age isn't a liability in the classroom, it's an asset." "What do you mean?" "I bring context they don't have. When we read Steinbeck, I can talk about what the Depression actually meant to families like ours. When we discuss the Vietnam War literature, I remember what it was like to have friends who didn't come home. I'm not competing with them, I'm complimenting them." Michael nodded slowly. "And you're really happy?" Harold looked around the room, at his family, at the textbooks stacked on his coffee table, at the future that stretched ahead of him with possibility, rather than just time to fill. "Michael, I'm not just happy. I'm alive in a way I haven't been in decades." Spring semester brought new courses and new challenges. Harold enrolled in Modern American Poetry, Introduction to Creative Writing, and the Literature of Social Justice. The workload was intense, but he had learned to pace himself and accept help when he needed it. The creative writing class proved to be both the most rewarding and most terrifying experience. Professor Lisa Park, a published novelist in her 30s, pushed her students to write from their deepest experiences. "Write what scares you," she told the class. "Write what you don't want to admit, even to yourself." Harold's first assignment was a memoir piece about the day he destroyed his original acceptance letter in 1962, he wrote about standing behind Morrison's General Store, tearing the letter into small pieces, watching his future blow away in the Iowa wind. I told myself I was being noble, he wrote. I was sacrificing my dreams for my family's survival. But the truth is more complicated. Part of me was terrified of leaving Cedar Falls, of trying to succeed in a world where I might fail. Destroying that letter wasn't just about duty, it was about fear. When Professor Park asked him to read the piece aloud to the class, Harold's hands shook. But as he read, he saw the impact his words had on his fellow students. Several were crying. Others nodded in recognition of their own fears about the future. Mr. Whitman, said a student named Maria after class, my grandmother sacrificed her dreams to raise her siblings too. She's always told us it was the right choice, but reading your story, I wonder if she's carried regret all these years like you did. Maybe, Harold said gently. Or maybe she found other ways to fulfill her dreams. Every story is different. Maria, but I think it's important to honor the complexity of these choices, not just the nobility. The poetry class opened up another dimension of Harold's mind. He had always been a careful reader of poetry, but Professor Jonathan Miller pushed students to understand how poems work, the relationship between form and meaning, the power of compressed language, the music of verse. Poetry is the most efficient form of communication, Professor Miller explained. Every word must earn its place. Harold found himself writing his first poem since high school. Tentative explorations of memory and time, 60 years between the letter and the desk, between the boy who dreamed and the man who dared to dream again. The classroom hasn't changed. Same hungry faces, same urgent questions, same belief that words can remake the world. Only I am different, carrying decades like books in a backpack. Heavy with knowledge I'm finally free to share. Word of Harold's story began to spread beyond the university. A journalism student interviewed him for the campus newspaper, and the story was picked up by the Cedar Falls Courier, then by regional media outlets. 82-year-old proves it's never too late for higher education, read the headline in the Des Moines Register. Soon Harold was fielding interview requests from television, stations and national publications. I didn't expect this attention, he told Sarah, during one of their weekly phone calls. I just wanted to go to school. Dad, you're inspiring people. There are probably thousands of people who gave up on their dreams and are seeing your story as permission to try again. The attention was both gratifying and overwhelming. Harold received letters from around the world, from a 65-year-old woman in Japan who was considering law school, from a 70-year-old man in Germany who wanted to study art history, from a 58-year-old woman in Brazil who had always dreamed of becoming a teacher. But the letter that moved him most came from Cedar Falls, from a woman named Dorothy Chen, Dr. Elizabeth Chen's mother. Dear Mr. Whitman, she wrote, I saw your story in the paper and wanted to share something with you. 40 years ago, I was accepted to nursing school. I was 35, a widow with 3 children, and everyone told me I was too old, too poor, too impractical. I let them convince me they were right. I've spent 40 years wondering what if. Your courage has inspired me to apply again. At 75, I'm probably too old to be a practicing nurse, but I'm not too old to learn. Thank you for showing me that dreams don't have expiration dates. Harold called Dorothy that evening. Mrs. Chen, this is Harold Whitman. I got your letter. Oh my goodness, Mr. Whitman. I can't believe you're calling me. I wanted to tell you that you're not too old. And even if you decide not to become a practicing nurse, the knowledge you'll gain, the satisfaction of completing something you've always wanted to do, that has value regardless of your age. Are you really happy you made this choice? Harold looked around his study, at his textbooks, at his essays pinned to a bulletin board, at the acceptance letters from summer programs he was considering. Mrs. Chen, I've never been happier in my life. As Harold's freshman year drew to a close, he faced a decision he hadn't expected to confront: what to do for sophomore year. His grades were excellent. He finished with a 3.8 GPA, earning him Dean's List recognition. His professors encouraged him to continue, but his family worried about the long-term sustainability of his academic pursuits. Dad, Sarah said during her visit for his graduation ceremony from freshman year. "What's your endgame here? Are you really planning to study for 4 more years?" Harold had been wondering the same thing. The academic work energized him, but the physical demands were significant. He was tired more often, and he'd had 2 more episodes of dizziness that landed him in the campus health center. "I don't know," he admitted. "I started this just wanting to prove to myself that I could do it. But now, I'm learning things, contributing things that feel important." "What does your heart tell you?" This from Jessica, now a high school senior dealing with her own college decisions. "My heart tells me that I'm finally doing what I was meant to do. My brain tells me that I need to be realistic about my physical limitations." The decision was made for him in an unexpected way. Professor Santos approached him after his final exam. "Mr. Whitman, I have a proposition for you. The university is launching a new program, Lifelong Learning Partnerships. It's designed for non-traditional students who want to continue their education but need flexibility. You'd work with faculty mentors on independent study projects, attend seminars but not carry a full course load." Harold felt a surge of relief and excitement. "That sounds perfect. But would I still be working toward a degree?" "Absolutely. It might take longer, but you'd graduate with the same English literature degree as any traditional student. The program recognizes that learning doesn't follow the same timeline for everyone." That evening, Harold called a family meeting via video conference, Sarah in California. Michael and his family gathered around their laptop in their living room. "I've decided to continue," he announced, "but in a modified program that will be gentler on my body and give me more flexibility." Michael's relief was visible. "Dad, that sounds like a perfect compromise." "I'm proud of you, Grandpa," Jessica said. "You're showing everyone that you can adapt your dreams without abandoning them." Harold's sophomore year looked dramatically different. Instead of sitting in lecture halls with 200 other students, he worked closely with 3 faculty mentors on independent research projects. With Professor Santos, he explored the connection between literature and social justice. With Professor Miller, he delved deeper into American poetry, focusing on works that dealt with aging and memory. With Professor Park, he continued developing his own writing. The new structure allowed Harold to bring his life experience more directly into his studies. His research project with Professor Santos became a comprehensive analysis of how literature had been used throughout American history to advocate for social change, drawing connections between the abolition movement, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and contemporary social justice causes. "You're not just studying these movements," Professor Santos told him during one of their weekly meetings. "You lived through many of them. You remember when these weren't historical events, but current events." Harold's writing project with Professor Park evolved into something none of them had expected, a full-length memoir about his journey back to education. The book, tentatively titled Never Too Late, An 82-Year-Old's Return to School, became a meditation on dreams deferred and dreams fulfilled, on the nature of regret and redemption, on what it means to live authentically at any age. "Harold," Professor Park said after reading his latest chapter, "this isn't just a memoir anymore. This is a book that could change how people think about aging, about opportunity, about second chances." "Do you really think so?" "I think you need to find a literary agent." The poetry project with Professor Miller yielded unexpected results as well. Harold's poems about memory, time, and learning began appearing in literary journals. One poem, Freshman at 82, was selected for inclusion in the Best American Poetry anthology. "They ask me why I came back now. These bright faces turn toward me like sunflowers following light. How do I tell them that I never left? That I've been a student all my life, just never in a classroom. Every book I read in secret, every conversation I longed to have, every question I swallowed for 60 years, they were all preparing me for this moment when learning became not just hunger but feast." Harold's story continued to inspire others, but now he was seeing the concrete results of that inspiration. Dorothy Chen, the 75-year-old woman who had written to him, was accepted into a nursing program designed for older students. She sent Harold updates on her progress, and they became unlikely study partners, encouraging each other through difficult moments. A 60-year-old man named Robert Martinez reached out after seeing Harold's story on television. Robert had always wanted to be a teacher, but had spent his career in construction to support his family. Now, with his children grown, he was applying to education school. "Mr. Whitman, I just wanted to thank you. I thought it was too late for me at 60. If you can do it at 82, I can certainly do it at 60. These connections began to form an informal network of older learners, all inspired by Harold's example, but pursuing their own dreams. Harold found himself becoming an unofficial advisor to people across the country who were considering returning to school. Later in life, the university took notice. The admissions office began featuring Harold's story in their marketing materials, but more importantly, they started actively recruiting older students. Applications from non-traditional students increased by 300% the year after Harold's story went national. "You've started a movement, Dad," Sarah told him during her Christmas visit. "People are calling it the Harold effect, but the most meaningful impact was closest to home. Jessica, now a college freshman herself, chose her grandfather's university, partly because of the reputation for supporting non-traditional learners. Grandpa," she said over dinner during winter break, "I want you to know that watching you chase your dreams made me braver about chasing mine. I'm majoring in environmental science, and everyone keeps telling me it's too hard, too competitive. But then I think about you starting college at 82, and I figure I can handle some tough classes at 18. Michael, too, had been changed by his father's example. At 55, he enrolled in evening business classes to get the MBA he had always wanted, but never thought he could afford the time to pursue. "You showed me that it's never too late to become who you want to be," he told Harold. "I may not be as dramatic as you, starting college in my 80s, but I'm finally investing in my own growth instead of just managing everyone else's." Harold's junior year began with a scare that put everything in perspective. During his annual physical, his doctor discovered irregularities in his blood work that suggested possible leukemia. The word cancer hung in the air like a physical presence. "We need to do more tests," Dr. Rebecca Martinez explained gently. "It might be nothing serious, but we need to be thorough." For 2 weeks, Harold waited for test results while trying to maintain his academic schedule. He didn't tell his family immediately, not wanting to worry them unnecessarily. But the weight of uncertainty was crushing. He found himself unable to concentrate on his reading, unable to write. For the first time since starting college, he questioned whether he was being selfish, whether he should have spent these years differently. "Professor Santos," he said during their weekly meeting, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. If you knew you only had a short time left, how would you want to spend it?" She studied his face carefully. "Harold, is everything okay?" He told her about the medical uncertainty, about his fears, about his sudden doubt about the choices he had made. "Harold," she said after a long pause, "I've watched you transform not just yourself but everyone around you over the past 2 years. You've shown students how to think more deeply. You've inspired people around the world to pursue their dreams. You've created something beautiful and meaningful. If this is how you've chosen to spend what might be your final years, I can't imagine a more purposeful way to live." When the test results came back, the news was better than feared. Harold had a treatable blood disorder that would require monitoring and medication, but it wasn't cancer, and it wasn't immediately life-threatening. "You've got years ahead of you," Dr. Martinez told him with a smile. "Plenty of time to finish that degree." Harold called his family with the good news, finally revealing the scare he had hidden from them. "Dad," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, "promise me you won't keep something like that from us again. We want to support you through everything, the good and the challenging." "I promise," Harold said. "I was trying to protect you, but I realize now that sharing our struggles is part of how we show love." Harold's junior year brought unexpected recognition. His memoir, Never Too Late, was published by a major publishing house and became a bestseller almost immediately. The book resonated with readers across generations, younger people, inspired by Harold's courage, older people empowered by his example. He was invited to speak at universities, libraries, and conferences around the country. The speaking engagements were both thrilling and exhausting, but Harold found deep satisfaction in connecting with audiences who saw their own struggles reflected in his story. The question I get most often, Harold told an audience at the University of Michigan, is how did you find the courage to start over at 82? But that's not the right question. The right question is, how did I finally find the courage to stop living a life that wasn't really mine? The university began offering a scholarship in Harold's name for non-traditional students. The first recipient was a 45-year-old single mother studying to become her social worker. "Mr. Whitman," she said at the scholarship ceremony, "your story gave me permission to believe that my dreams mattered. Even though I'm older than most students, even though I have children to support, even though everyone said I was being impractical." Harold was also invited to join the university's Board of Advisors for Adult Learning Initiatives. His role was to help the institution better serve older students and to advocate for policies that recognized the unique challenges and contributions of non-traditional learners. "Harold brings a perspective we've never had before," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the university's Vice Provost for Academic Affairs. "He understands both the barriers older students face and the incredible value they bring to the academic community." As Harold entered his senior year, the impact of his journey on his family became even more apparent. Jessica, now a sophomore, had become an advocate for environmental justice on campus, inspired by her grandfather's example of standing up for what he believed in. Ryan, now a freshman at a different university, chose to study history with a focus on oral history, collecting and preserving the stories of older Americans. "Grandpa," he said during spring break, "your story made me realize how much wisdom is walking around in older people that we never bother to ask about. I want to make sure those stories don't get lost." Michael had completed his MBA and was using his new skills to help other family businesses navigate economic challenges. "Dad taught me that learning doesn't stop when you reach a certain age," he explained to a local business journal. "If he can start college at 82, I can certainly get an MBA at 55. Sarah had made changes too. She left her corporate job in San Francisco to become a freelance writer, finally pursuing the creative career she had always dreamed of but never thought was practical. "Dad showed me that practical isn't the only way to live," she told Harold during one of their phone calls. "He showed me that following your passion isn't selfish, it's inspiring to everyone around you." The most unexpected change was in Harold's relationship with his late wife's memory. For 3 years after Martha's death, he had felt guilty about moving forward, about changing the life they had built together. But his return to school had helped him understand that honoring Martha's memory didn't mean staying frozen in grief. "I think Mom would be proud of you," Sarah told him. "She always knew you had more to give." "I hope so," Harold said. "I feel like I'm finally becoming the person she married, the person I was meant to be all along." Chapter 21, Senior Year and Reflection. Harold's senior year was both culmination and beginning. His thesis project was an ambitious undertaking, a comprehensive analysis of how American literature had evolved to include previously marginalized voices from the Harlem Renaissance through contemporary diverse authors. "You're not just studying literary history," Professor Santos observed during one of their thesis meetings. "You're witnessing literary history. You've lived through the social changes that enabled these voices to be heard." The thesis became a 200-page exploration of literature as social change, drawing on Harold's lifetime of reading and his newfound academic rigor. It was accepted for presentation at the National Conference on American Literature, making Harold, at 85, one of the oldest presenters in the conference's history. But the real capstone of his academic journey was a course he helped design, Literature and Life Experience, a seminar that paired traditional college students with community members over 65 to explore how literature reflected and shaped their lived experiences. The course became one of the most popular on campus. Students were paired with older community members to discuss assigned readings, with both generations bringing their perspectives to bear on the texts. "It's incredible," said Amanda, a 20-year-old English major, "reading The Grapes of Wrath with Mrs. Henderson, whose family actually migrated from Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl, completely changed how I understood the novel." Harold served as the course coordinator, facilitating discussions and helping bridge generational gaps. The course was so successful that other universities began adopting similar programs. "Harold, you've created something that will outlast your time here," Professor Miller told him. "You've shown how intergenerational learning can enrich everyone involved." As graduation approached, Harold found himself dealing with emotions he hadn't expected. The completion of his degree represented the fulfillment of a 60-year-old dream, but it also marked the end of a chapter that had become central to his identity. "I don't want it to end," he admitted to Dr. Chen during one of his regular medical checkups. "These have been the best 4 years of my life." "Harold, ending one chapter doesn't mean the story is over. You've proven that learning is a lifelong process. Graduation isn't the end of your education, it's recognition of how much you've grown." Harold had been accepted to a master's program in English, but he wasn't sure he wanted to continue formal education. At 85, he was feeling the physical demands of academic life more acutely. "Maybe it's time to find other ways to share what I've learned," he told Jessica. During one of their study sessions together, she had made it a tradition to spend at least one afternoon a week studying alongside her grandfather, even though their subjects were completely different. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about writing more, maybe teaching in some capacity. I want to help other older people who might be considering going back to school." "Grandpa, you've already helped thousands of people, but I think you're right. There are probably other ways to make an impact." The decision about his future was complicated by a new opportunity. A documentary filmmaker wanted to follow Harold through his final semester and graduation, capturing the conclusion of his remarkable journey. "I'm not sure I want that level of attention," Harold told his family during their weekly video call. "Dad," Michael said, "your story has inspired so many people. Maybe showing them the culmination of your journey will inspire even more. But what if I don't graduate? What if something happens to my health? What if I fail?" Sarah laughed. "Dad, you've been on the dean's list every semester. You're not going to fail. And even if something unexpected happened, your journey would still be inspiring. You've already succeeded in ways that have nothing to do with a diploma." Harold's final semester was both challenging and poignant. He was taking his last 2 required courses while working on his thesis and managing the intergenerational literature course he had helped create. The documentary crew followed him through his daily routine: early morning study sessions, a classroom, discussions where he was now recognized as a peer by professors and students alike, office hours where younger students sought his perspective on their own academic and personal challenges. "Mr. Whitman," asked Tyler, a junior who was struggling with depression, "how do you stay motivated when everything feels overwhelming?" They were sitting in the campus coffee shop, an unlikely counseling session between an 85-year-old undergraduate and a 21-year-old who was questioning whether college was worth the stress. "Tyler, I won't pretend to understand exactly what you're going through, but I can tell you that meaning is the best antidote to despair I've ever found. When I was your age, I gave up on my dreams and spent 60 years wondering what if. The regret was harder to bear than any challenge I've faced in the classroom. But what if I fail? What if I'm not smart enough, not strong enough?" Harold looked at this young man who reminded him of his own grandson and felt a familiar surge of protective affection. "Tyler, failure isn't not graduating. Failure is not trying. Failure is letting fear make your decisions for you. You're here, you're struggling, you're asking the right questions. That's not failure, that's courage." These conversations, repeated dozens of times throughout his final semester, reminded Harold why he had found college so meaningful. It wasn't just about fulfilling his own dreams, it was about being part of a community of learners, each supporting the other's growth. Harold's thesis defense was scheduled for early May, just 3 weeks before graduation. The committee consisted of 3 professors from the English department and 1 external examiner from the University of Northern Iowa. Mr. Whitman, said Professor Davis, the external examiner, your thesis argues that American literature has been fundamentally shaped by the inclusion of previously marginalized voices. Can you explain how your own experience as an older student informs this argument? Harold had prepared for this question, but answering it in the moment felt both personal and profound. Professor Davis, for 60 years, I was a marginalized voice in the academy, not because of my race or gender, but because of my age and my non-traditional path. When I finally got the chance to contribute to academic conversations, I brought perspectives that wouldn't have existed otherwise. I think that's what happens every time literature expands to include new voices. We don't just get different stories, we get different ways of understanding all stories. The defense lasted 2 hours. Harold answered questions about his research methodology, his historical analysis, his literary interpretations, and his conclusions. When the committee asked him to step outside while they deliberated, he felt the same nervousness he had experienced before his very first college exam. Professor Santos emerged with a smile. Congratulations, Mr. Whitman. Your thesis has been accepted with highest honors. You've made a significant contribution to American literary scholarship. Harold felt tears welling up, tears of relief, of pride, of completion. That evening, he called Martha's grave, a habit he had maintained throughout his college years, and told her about the successful defense. I think you would have been proud, sweetheart. I finally finished what I started 60 years ago. May 15th, 2028, 4 years to the day after Harold received his acceptance letter, he stood in line with 847 other graduating seniors, wearing a cap and gown that his great-grandchildren had helped him decorate, with small pins representing his academic honors. The documentary crew captured the moment, but Harold barely noticed them. He was focused on the surreal experience of being 85 years old and graduating from college. His entire family was there. Sarah and her husband had flown in from California. Michael and Jennifer sat in the front row. Jessica and Ryan flanked their parents. Even some of his former classmates had returned for the ceremony, wanting to celebrate with the man who had become a symbol of perseverance and possibility. Harold Whitman, the dean announced, Bachelor of Arts in English Literature, summa cum laude, phi beta kappa. The crowd erupted. It wasn't just Harold's family cheering. Hundreds of people in the audience, many of whom didn't even know him personally, stood and applauded. He had become more than a student. He had become a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept that it was too late. As Harold walked across the stage, he thought about the 18-year-old boy who had torn up his first acceptance letter behind Morrison's General Store. He thought about the 60 years of wondering what if. He thought about Martha, who had always believed he had more to give. He thought about all the people who had written to him, called him, approached him, to say that his story had inspired them to pursue their own deferred dreams. When the dean handed him his diploma, Harold felt something he had never experienced before, complete alignment between who he was and who he was meant to be. Epilogue, the continuing story. 6 months after graduation, Harold Whitman published his second book, Learning Never Ends, A Guide for Older Students. The book became a practical resource for people considering returning to education later in life, addressing everything from financial considerations to study strategies to dealing with imposter syndrome. He declined admission to the master's program, choosing instead to travel the country, speaking at universities, libraries, and community centers. His message was simple but powerful. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. The intergenerational literature program he had helped design was now operating at 30 universities across the country. The Harold Whitman Scholarship had supported over 100 non-traditional students in pursuing their degrees. Dorothy Chen, the 75-year-old woman who had been inspired by Harold's story to pursue nursing, graduated with her degree and was working part-time at a community health clinic, specializing in geriatric care. Robert Martinez, the 60-year-old construction worker who had wanted to be a teacher, was now teaching high school history and coaching the debate team. Michael completed his MBA and used his new skills to help other family businesses navigate challenges. Sarah's freelance writing career was thriving, and she was working on her own book about family, dreams and second chances. Jessica graduated with honors in environmental science and was accepted to graduate school to study climate policy. Ryan was completing an oral history project about older High Americans who had returned to education, inspired by his grandfather's journey. At 86, Harold Whitman was busier than he had ever been. He served on several university advisory boards, continued writing, and maintained correspondence with hundreds of people who had been inspired by his story to pursue their own dreams. "People ask me if I have any regrets about waiting so long," Harold said in a recent interview. "But I don't think I could have done this at 18, or even at 40. I needed all those years of life experience to bring something meaningful to the classroom. I needed the wisdom that comes from raising a family, building a business, losing a spouse, facing mortality. Those 60 years weren't wasted time, they were preparation." The documentary about Harold's journey, titled Never Too Late, won several awards and sparked a national conversation about ageism, education, and the untapped potential of older Americans. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the quiet impact Harold continued to have on individual lives. His email inbox was filled with messages from people around the world who had been inspired to pursue their own deferred dreams. "Dear Mr. Whitman," read a recent letter from a 67-year-old woman in Maine. "I saw your documentary and decided to apply to art school. I've been accepted and start next month. I wanted to thank you for showing me that dreams don't have expiration dates." Another letter came from a 72-year-old man in Texas. "I always wanted to be a social worker, but became an accountant instead. Inspired by your story. I'm volunteering at a homeless shelter and taking classes to become a certified counselor. At 72, I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be." These letters reminded Harold daily that his decision to pursue his deferred dream had created ripples that extended far beyond his own life. On quiet evenings, Harold would sit in his study, surrounded by his college textbooks and the hundreds of letters from people his story had touched. He would think about the boy who had torn up that first acceptance letter, about the man who had spent 60 years wondering what if, about the student who had finally found the courage to find out. "It's never too late," he would whisper to himself, words that had become both his motto and his gift to the world. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Harold Whitman's story reminds us that the timeline for dreams is not set by society, by age or by circumstances. It's set by courage, the courage to believe that we deserve our dreams, no matter when we find the strength to pursue them. His journey from an 82-year-old man with a secret regret to an 86-year-old inspiration to thousands proves that the most important lessons in life sometimes come not from the paths we take early, but from the paths we finally find the courage to take at all.